guys, welcome to UPLINK TV. This is part of the video game history series, and today we're going to be talking about the third generation of video game consoles. My name is George Portugal, and
I'm John.
Yep. So to start off Gen 3, we got to mention a little bit about what was happening with Generation 2. So if you watch that video, you'll know that in the North American market, the video game industry was basically in a free fall.
It was destroyed completely after Atari. I mean, really, the quality of the games was so poor. I think the most famous example would be E.T.
Yeah, everyone remembers E.T.
Everybody,
absolutely.
It's
but it was. You're right. There were so many games being produced by literally anybody who could.
Right.
And the quality was impossible to tell. You would buy them and you'd never know if it was good or bad.
Exactly. And one of the things too that was interesting, the box art. If you remember buying the games, and you would see the box art, and it was just like these beautiful, drawn, illustrated. And I remember as a kid, I'd look at these boxes and I'd be like, oh my God, I'm going to be this, barbarian wizard. And then you turn it on, and then it's like bink, 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 and you're in a block.
Exactly. So people were really let down, and they didn't really know what they were buying, and so. And then there were just too many consoles to begin with, and so this ended up just making the market implode here.
The saturation just deep-sixed it completely.
That's right. So by 1983, people were pretty convinced that video games were a fad, that they were just like pet rocks from the 70s. They're just going to come and go, and that was it.
Sure.
But in the rest of the world, things were very different. In particular, in Japan, the video game market was thriving. And Nintendo, in particular, went from, and Sega, they both went from companies that were, licensing their properties onto other consoles to thinking like, hey, we should make our own video game consoles.
Well, the interesting thing about the Nintendo in particular is that originally Nintendo had approached Atari, and they told them that they were going to bring, Atari was going to bring the NES to market in the United States. Prior to the crash, and Atari was basically like, no, why, we don't need to get into this. Why should we let a competitor in and that sort of thing? Ironically, of course, we all know how that turned out.
Yeah. So there was a point at which Nintendo was thinking about having their property licensed by Atari and released in the United States. Yeah.
And that's why you see a lot of those Mario games and Donkey Kong games, on the older consoles. There was a lot of that going on.
Yeah, that's right. So at that time, Nintendo, they were convinced they had a hit on their hands, and they wanted to bring their hardware into the United States, but they really struggled. Nobody was interested in video games. They couldn't get anyone to distribute it or manufacture or buy it or anything like that. And so at some point, Nintendo was like, we're just gonna go it on our own.
Do it, yeah.
And they started thinking about how to make it look, and so you can really see that like what they were trying to do with this console was sort of like what you saw in Generation 2. They were trying to make something that people were familiar with.
Yeah.
So this, this console really, it has the appearance of like a Betamax
or like a VCR.
Or a VCR.
Yes, very VCR-like.
Where you take your cartridge and you bring it in, and then it has this like zero insertion force mechanism.
Yeah.
Where you just put it in like that, and that experience was very much like what people were used to with their VCRs and Betamax and with tape decks.
Sure.
And so they were trying to give this impression of something that people knew, and they were also, there was a lot of subterfuge with what this product was.
The way it was sold and marketed, well, I remember how the way it was marketed, it wasn't marketed as a console. That's why it's called the entertainment system. The name itself really is just sleight of hand. Really,
Yeah.
It was a way for the stores, the toy stores in particular, to just accept it as a toy, and that's the big reason we saw the Rob ad on.
Yeah, Rob the Robot was a big part of that, and they had different terminology for these things too. This was like a pack.
A game pack.
Yeah,
that's right.
Or a Nintendo tape.
That's right.
And
yes.
and so people were easily thinking that this was something that it wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in the end, when they finally were ready to bring this to market, what they did was they decided that they needed a test market in the United States first.
Yes.
And
like New York.
Yeah, that's right. So
FAO Schwartz. I do remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So the Nintendo was first launched here in New York City. They decided, if we're gonna go and do this, we're gonna go big. We're gonna do it in the biggest market in the United States. And
they sure did.
Yeah, and it sold like hotcakes, and things kind of really took off from there.
Yep.
So of course, we're talking a lot about the Nintendo, and this was the most successful console in the generation by far, but that's not to say that, you know, there weren't other things going on at the same time.
Right.
So, like I was saying before, Sega had very similar ambitions to Nintendo, and they had already made, you know, successful arcades. They had created something called the SG-1000 in Japan. It wasn't nearly as successful as Nintendo's home console, but you know, it had some success.
It did have a lot of that tied into Sega's success in the arcades. So, you know, in terms of market share, obviously the console market share was very, very low, but in the arcades, I mean, you couldn't walk 2 steps without running into a new Sega arcade machine. So they were more or less the masters of that domain.
Yeah,
and they were able to leverage
a
lot of their properties into their SG-1000 machine, which made it somewhat successful in Japan, and I think it kind of convinced them that they could play with the big boys, so to speak, you know, with the NES and kind of go head to head. Whether or not they were successful?
I mean, it's an interesting story with the Master System, because if you look in the United States, like, they were handedly defeated by Nintendo. Nintendo was like the dominant cultural force of the 80s for video games by far. But if you go elsewhere in the world,
Europe, for example.
Yeah, if you go to Europe, this console was far more successful. Nintendo kind of ignored the European market.
Very much so.
And if you go to other regions, like actually, if you go to Brazil, to this day, you can buy a Master System, brand new in the box, still being manufactured by Tectoy. So this console that is, you know, now 30 plus years old is, you can still buy it.
What happened was Sega did something interesting. Brazil has these draconian tax laws when it comes to imports. So even now, if you go to buy a PS4 or an Xbox in Brazil, you're going to pay 4 or 5 times the amount that you would here.
Right, because it's not made there.
Exactly.
That's
so,
right.
So the import tax is just, you take a huge hit on that. Sega was smart enough to say, you know what, let's have our manufacturing branch there. So the Master Systems and the Genesis were manufactured in Brazil.
Yeah, with this company called Tectoy, and they still do that.
And they still do, and they're still very popular because they still have those tax laws. So you still see games being made to this day over there.
That's right.
Which is really amazing, the longevity. When people ask, like, what's the most successful or long-lived console, you generally don't expect to hear the Master System.
But it is.
But it is.
Yeah, that's right.
It's still relevant.
That's right.
Today. Yeah.
And then, meanwhile, you know, at the same time, you know, Atari was also still very much in the video games market, and you know, they had lots of turmoil. Their home computer division split off from their video game division. They had lots of layoffs and financial turmoil, but you know, they were still in the game of making video game consoles. And so, you know, they had kind of learned some of the mistakes that they had made in the second generation. They made the Atari 5200, where it was not at first backwards compatible. It had a really awful controller interface.
Terrible, and it was, I mean, the size, it was a monstrosity.
It was.
Putting it on a shelf, you'd probably take up half the table. You know, I mean, you guys saw it before. It's just ginormous thing, and it just weighed so much, and it was clunky looking,
exactly.
ugly, aesthetically speaking, it was terrible.
So they learned from those mistakes, and they designed a system that was fully backwards compatible with the 2600, which was very successful. And then, you know, their joysticks to this day hold up very well. They have a really nice interface. The buttons are responsive. When you find these out there, they really don't fail. They're pretty reliable. And so, you know, they did their best to kind of reclaim their market share, but they were too late in the game, and then comparing their hardware, you know, to both the Master System and the Nintendo, there's really a lot left to be desired. So they were still kind of...
The hardware is interesting with this in particular. Atari, for some reason that I can't wrap my head around, they decided to keep the sound chip the same. So one of the things you notice if you play a 7800 is you'll see this great upgrading graphics. You know, if you're jumping from 2600, for example, to 7800, I mean, it's just a world of difference.
Yeah, it really is.
Details, colors, I mean, a lot of really cool stuff going on here, but then you hear the sounds, and you hear those hard, crunchy sounds that would come from the 2600, and it's startling a little bit, you know what I mean? Because you're expecting, you know, a better fidelity, you know, sound-wise, and you're getting those hard bleeps and bloops that just don't mesh well, and it just that's definitely kind of a thing you expect with the 7800. You know, let's talk a little bit about the games, because I feel like that's also something where if you look at the games on these 3 platforms, there's actually some really significant differences. Yes.
So you know, when we were talking about Generation 2, a lot of those games were just faithful arcade ports. You know, like there was no necessarily objective. It was like get the high score, and they were trying to replicate that as much as they could. And you know, like Centipede here, this is a great example. Like this is a really nice arcade port, and you know, the graphics are pretty good, the sounds are good, and it's a good representation of what you get in the arcade.
Yeah, sure.
But then, like, let's transition over to the Nintendo really quick. And here's the iconic Legend of Zelda.
Legend of Zelda, yeah.
This game really is trying to do something revolutionary.
It broke open the idea. The thing was, the big difference, I think, between Gen 2 and Gen 3 in terms of gaming was that Gen 3 allowed game designers to tell a story.
Yes.
A coherent story. Whereas in the past, you know, yeah, Centipede, I mean, they would give you a premise. You know, premise is you're this guy, you're in a garden, you're shooting space invaders.
Right.
Premise is you're in a spaceship, guard the things, missile command. You know,
yeah, these basic premises.
Basic premise. I mean, there was very few games, maybe the Sword Quest games, that attempted to kind of weave a narrative.
Right.
Yeah. So now with these power of these systems, suddenly, you know, you had more room to tell a story, you know, coherent story from beginning to end, and you start to see a lot of that happening here. Zelda, as you said, is probably the most well-known example, biggest example.
But there's even arcade ports where Nintendo, the console versions, the Nintendo versions are really a step up and above what you'd see.
Absolutely.
Like Rygar's a great example of that, where if you play the arcade, it's not nearly as good as the Nintendo version. Or Strider, that's another good one.
Strider's another one as well, yeah. They expanded so much, and Strider doesn't really change gameplay-wise as much.
But there's a story.
But yes, there is definitely way more of a story. Whereas Rygar, for example, the gameplay, it just fundamentally changed so much. It was, I guess you could say it was like a Metroidvania
kind of game. Yeah.
Very much so. The only thing, unfortunately, is you know, saving your game wasn't so much of a thing. Zelda is probably, I would say, the pioneer console-wise of saving.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That was something that was exclusively in the realm of PCs at the time. You know, if you're a PC gamer, you're playing RPGs and things like that, and you want to save your game, it's very simple. You have your disc, and you just save your game, and you go. Whereas a console, you know, you're playing
you're using your passwords, really long passwords or nothing, and that's it.
Right, get through to it. Even Metroid, for example, is a great example of a game that, Castlevania and Metroid are two great examples of games that in Japan you were able to save because of the disc system add-on. And when they came to America, suddenly you had these very long, very complicated passwords. I don't know if you remember, if you ever wrote down the passwords in Metroid.
I did, and you would sometimes like make a 0 look like an O, and you'd be trying to figure out what you did wrong. It was the worst.
Some of these symbols were, I mean, they were like hieroglyphics almost. It was incredible, and I remember so many times as a kid, it was like a small A, and then like you get the squiggle wrong, and then you'd be sitting on that password and going, oh, is that
exactly.
A? Is that an E? Is that, you know, very, very complicated and difficult. Zelda really, I think, just broke it
things open. Yeah.
Changed the game.
It really did.
You know, literally by allowing people to save and putting the batteries. And the batteries, which I may add, are incredibly long-lived in a lot of instances. I mean, a lot of times you'll get a cartridge and
a 40-year-old cartridge with a working battery.
Find a save from you know, probably some kid in 1988, and you know, it's just you're like, wow, and you just think that, you know, that was someone's story, someone's you know, experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's still there.
I always, whenever I would find a save game, I always make it a point, unless all the slots are taken, but I would at least keep one of those slots, you know, just kind of as a homage to the person. Just like, you know, like, hey buddy, you know, you're still there. I'm not gonna let you have your little spot on the cartridge. You know what I mean? So yeah. I do that. But Zelda was great, and it started, I think, that pattern. And I think more and more developers were encouraged by the success of that, and we started to see more battery-backed games. You know, like Dragon Warrior, for example, is another good example of that evolution happening. Whereas, you know, a JRPG like that was really just the realm of PCs at the time.
At the time, yeah, that's right.
So
yeah, I mean, I think, you can definitely see how the game's changed. And I think, you know, another thing you can tell when you're looking at these consoles is, you know, the way you play the game has changed. So, if you look at the Nintendo controller or if you look at the Sega Master System controller, it's defined by the D-pad. So this is that D-pad that we first see in Gunpei Yokoi's Game & Watches in Generation 2. And now suddenly they're everywhere. So you can see them in the Master System and in the Nintendo. They're not on the 7800, although I think they may have made a controller with that later on. There might have been. I'm not sure.
Possibly.
But they were the exception. Another thing too is you'll notice these cords are huge, and so with Generation 2, the way you played the game was different. You'd have these consoles close to you, and you'd have the controller nearby too. So everything was close to you. With Generation 3, the expectation was that this stuff is going to stay by the television, and the controller comes out to you, and so the whole experience changed with that generation.
It's interesting because that goes back to the way I think that the NES was marketed in America versus Japan and the rest of the world, because the Famicom did have the hardwired controller, so it was the same idea. You were expected to kind of
have
like
it close
Gen 2 be in there, whereas this being marketed as an entertainment system, it was expected to sit alongside your VCR, alongside your Betamax, alongside your television, not necessarily be pulled around to different places, which would owe to the lengthier cord. And I don't know if you want to talk real briefly about the D-pad itself, but you notice on the Master System, it's a D-pad, but it doesn't have that cross shape. And I believe Nintendo had a patent of that. And I think a lot of companies were worried of running afoul of Nintendo's patents. And I don't think that there was another console that had the same cross
No, it took
style.
Sega a while to figure out a good D-pad that didn't violate Nintendo's patents. And yeah, if you look at the SG-1000, the very first version of the Sega Master System that was released in Japan, it has a joystick, not too different from like a 7800 or something like that. But then, once they saw that the NES took off, in Japan, they wanted to adapt that control scheme, and so they did their best. They made a D-pad, but it's just not the same as what Nintendo did.
Now, we talk real briefly about, in terms of innovation, probably for me, I think, the biggest innovation of this generation was the pause button.
No, the pause button was in Gen 2.
Where?
The 5200.
It had a pause button?
Yeah.
I did not. I had no idea.
No,
little did I know.
52. That's all right.
Was it on the console itself?
No, it was on the controller.
I had no clue.
My
goodness.
So no, sorry.
Wow, young me would have been like, you can get up and go to the bathroom. That was I don't recall that, because even as a kid to me, it was the craziest thing. I remember seeing a friend of mine playing Zelda, and I remember him
just stop.
He hits the button. I'm like, what happened? Is everything okay?
It was still novel. Only one of those consoles in Gen 2 had one. So and that was one of the later ones. So it was still a novel concept. So when all of these had pause, it was still kind of like a big deal. You're absolutely right.
I had no idea. That's amazing.
So I think one other thing we can talk about, since we're on the topic of the controllers too, is just like accessories, because man, are there a lot of accessories for Generation 3.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So
we can start with the NES. Obviously the big one, I think, the most crucial one is Rob, which is ironic because it's also the most useless one.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was.
Let's be real. The Rob robot is a piece of garbage. It's a garbage accessory. It can only be used with, I think, 2 games?
Only 2 games, Gyromite and Stack Up. That's it.
Gyromite and Stack Up.
That's right.
Wrecking Crew? No, Wrecking Crew
No,
wasn't
it's only
out.
2.
Yeah.
And it was mostly a marketing ploy. It was mostly like, this is an entertainment system. Buy it so you can play with this cool robot.
Yeah.
And in the end, once Rob had served his purpose, nobody cared anymore.
It was it was a Trojan horse of accessories, you could call it.
It
was almost,
was.
It was just the way to sneak in, because nothing screams toy more than a little toy robot.
And that was such a big thing in the 80s, those toy robots.
I loved it. I remember seeing it, and I remember when I first got my Nintendo, I didn't get the Rob the Robot, and I was disappointed. I was like,
me too.
I really want one of those robots.
It took me a long time to get mine, and I had to have one
Thank
eventually.
goodness I didn't actually, save up paper route money to shell out for that thing, because I would have been enormously disappointed. at how terrible and how useless and
that's right. But yeah, not all of them were useless, because I mean you've got things like the NES Advantage.
That's right.
Which gives you a more arcade-like experience. You've got the
light gun.
Of course, the light gun.
Let's talk about the light gun. The light gun, I think, alongside the robot, was probably the biggest factor as far as sneaking it into toy stores and getting retailers to carry the product. And if you see a lot of the media from the time, even when they were demoing these things, I mean, 9 times out of 10 you would see a person playing, with the light phaser. It was really sold as really sold the whole toy line
component to the NES.
And it was just cool. Let's be real. I mean, it was just such a universal thing. It reminds me of how the Wii not too long ago. It became this multi-generational thing. You see kids, and then you would see grandparents, playing Wii bowling, playing whatever. And with the NES, I think the Zapper was one of those things where
everyone understood it. Everyone understood.
Very simple to grasp.
The Power Pad felt like that too, because it was much like Wii Fit in the more modern age.
Right.
And yeah, it's something that you could just use, and it was like an exercise kind of accessories.
Yeah.
So there were some useful ones. There were some useless ones, like the Rollin' Rocker or the Power Glove.
Yeah. Oh, the Rollin' Rocker, the Power Glove. Oh Lord.
Yeah. So
I just want to give talking about the phaser for a second. I remember many years ago, my grandfather came over. He's from the old world. And he came here. He was watching me play, and I mean, he doesn't understand any of these things.
No.
He couldn't even speak English. He just was just sitting there. He's like, what is this? And he sees me, shoot the ducks, and he's like, huh? And I remember his face when he took the phaser for the first time and he started shooting. 15 minutes later, he's going.
Yeah.
You see him, and
I had the same experience with my parents. They hate video games to this day, but they both played Duck Hunt. They knew how to play Duck Hunt. They enjoyed Duck Hunt. And so it had that universal appeal.
The killer app, you might say.
Yeah, that's right.
Duck Hunt, the killer app. Yeah.
So I guess aside from the NES, the Master System also had some cool accessories too.
It did.
It had also its own light gun. It had 3D glasses, which was really cool.
Yes.
And those you need a CRT to use in the modern day, but they do work, and it's an interesting kind of effect.
Nintendo, they had a lot more accessories, but a lot of them were Japan exclusive. They did have 3D glasses, and it never came here. A lot of things changed. The Famicom had a light gun as well, but it looked like a gun. It looked like a gun. You take that out in public, and you're going to get
in trouble.
You're going
to get in trouble.
So the redesign is a big part of that. But I would say accessory-wise, I mean, arguably, the Master System had more useful accessories.
I would say
overall,
that too. Yeah.
Because even the 3D glasses were remarkably.
They were good.
Yeah, they were just well designed. They worked exactly the way they should. There wasn't any misleading marketing or anything going on. When you put those glasses on and you played, I'm trying to think, what was one of the? Was Outrun?
Safari Hunt.
Safari, yeah. I mean, it really, the effect was.
Oh no! It was Hang On. Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
It really, really gave you that sensation, the 3D sensation that a lot of other toys and things, gadgets at the time just couldn't do. They advertised it,
but it wasn't really good.
You would bring it home and you'd be like, oh, this is, I'm gonna be sick, that kind of thing.
That's right.
So.
So yeah, go ahead.
Well, we want to talk about games a little bit.
What I was gonna bring up next is if you get one of these things nowadays, how do you use it on a television? Because it's a little bit easier than Generation 2, but it's not that much better.
One of the unfortunate, I think, problems with this design, of course, is I'm sure anyone's ever played Nintendo. You put the cartridge in, 9 times out of 10, what happens?
You get a blinking light.
You get that blinking light, and then just hit it, blow into the cartridge, and that sort of thing. And I think, unfortunately, because of the hinge,
the zero insertion force mechanism, it wears out, and then you don't make good connection between the cartridge and the motherboard. And thankfully, nowadays there are replacements that eliminate that problem.
Yeah, I mean, you work on these all the time, so I'm sure you see what happens to the pins. Maybe you could sort of describe how the mechanism works a little bit.
So they bend, and eventually they just stop making good connection. But there's devices like the blinking light win, which allows you to connect it directly and permanently, so you're not going to have connection issues anymore. But yeah, aside from that, though, I mean, these consoles either output only RF, just like Generation 2, or composite video. And so most televisions nowadays don't have those connections. And so, thankfully there are ways of getting a higher quality image from these. With the Nintendo, there's modifications like the NES RGB mod, which gives you the highest quality analog signal and lets you connect that up to something like an OSSC or a FrameMeister, which lets you output it from HDMI. With the Master System, it natively outputs RGB, which is great. So with the right kinds of cables and hardware, you can get a really, really crisp image via HDMI.
Just natively?
Yeah, just natively. So that's very nice.
Wow, that's
with the 7800, there's a little bit less in terms of video upgrades, but one can potentially upgrade this to S-Video, and then with a device like the Retro, yes, and with a device like
involve internal
modifications. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So you can add in a board that gives you S-Video output, and then with a device like the RetroTink, you can get HDMI to your television.
And the RetroTink is basically just a signal converter.
It's a line doubler, and then it converts it from a analog signal to a digital and an output.
So it takes that fuzzy old composite and it turns it into a nice crisp HD signal for your nice flat screen these days, which unfortunately don't count on using your light guns because that's not going to be happening.
That's not going to happen.
But can you tell us a little bit why exactly don't the light guns work on the newer TVs? Because you hear that they don't, but nobody really ever explains why they don't. So
yeah, sure. I can tell you. So the reason why the light guns work on CRTs and they don't work on modern displays has to do with timing differences. So modern displays they don't refresh as rapidly, I believe, as CRTs. CRTs are way faster, and so there's just a little bit of asynchrony between the light gun firing and what's going on with the television. And so if you don't get a good match there, then every time you shoot, you're going to have a miss.
It's not picking up that little bulb of light there.
So some people have developed ways of getting around this where you can get the signals to sync up, and so that's been done to the NES, and some people are developing other solutions for it. But
it's amazing that it's taken that long to
do
that. Considering, especially now, the resurgence and popularity of these systems, these very few viable solutions for light gun gaming. And light gun gaming is fun.
It's a lot of fun. I know.
I love it.
I have a CRT at home for that, and I love that. But it would be really nice, honestly, if I could do it on a regular display.
Wouldn't it be something? It would be amazing. So the 7800, I don't believe had a light gun, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure.
If it did, it was something rather obscure, maybe in the European market. I think it did a little bit better in Europe. But yeah, in terms of accessories, I think that this system had kind of the least, but it also, I think, performed the poorest compared to the other two as well. So.
I would say so. This, while this wasn't Atari's swan song, I guess the Jaguar was
the Jaguar was their final
swan
console.
Song.
Yeah.
I think that this was the one that kind of, started the tipping over into the,
they were already pretty much in decline at that point.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of mismanagement over there too, unfortunately, at Atari. Whereas Nintendo, on the other hand, they were, just very focused. Now let's talk a little bit about the software and the type of protections that these consoles had in order to stop piracy and to enforce quality control, because as we just discussed, a big part of the reason why Gen 2 causes severe crash is just because the lack of quality control. I mean, anyone who
could write a game could make it.
Just pop it out there and you could be as misleading as you like. There was very little oversight as far as how honest you were allowed to be, and you were allowed to be as dishonest as you please.
As you wanted to, yeah.
However, Nintendo.
Yeah, so Nintendo, in Japan, when their system was a runaway hit, they realized very quickly that they needed to enforce some kind of quality control and limit who could make games and who couldn't make games. So they developed something called the 10NES chip. And what that chip does is it communicates with a chip that's inside of every single cartridge that's manufactured. And so if there's an improper communication or no communication at all, it will not allow the game to boot at all. So this was first implemented in Japan, and then once the system was developed and made for the United States, this 10NES lockout chip was available as well. And for quite a long time, it was successful in preventing third parties from making whatever game that they wanted to.
But not forever, was it?
No, not forever. No.
So let's talk a little bit about Atari.
Yeah, let's talk about Atari.
So
Atari, they had a division called Tengen that was a third-party licensee for Nintendo. And in 1987 or 88 or something like that, they were really getting fed up with dealing with Nintendo.
I think there was a limit. I believe it was, what, 2 games per year,
there was a limit on titles they could make. There was also a chip shortage, which made manufacturing of anything at the time very difficult.
And I think that's a big reason why we saw a lot of the delays. I remember Legend of Zelda 2, Mario 2, and Legend of Zelda 2 also. I remember Nintendo Power, they had announced this is coming, and everybody was anticipating, and then suddenly the next issue they said, well, sorry, it's not going to come till next year. And then I'm already going, oh,
and
no.
even when they came out, like the supply was just so low compared to the demand. So yeah, Tengen was like, had it up to here with Nintendo at that point. And so they took a kind of quick and dirty look at Nintendo's copyright and patents. And then they reversed the 10 NES chip to make their own lockout chip, so that they could make their own games and play them on Nintendo hardware without Nintendo's permission. Which
they were very cool looking games.
Yeah, they had
the cartridges were very cool looking in particular. They were these sleek black.
Yeah.
Just the illustrations were beautiful.
They were good games.
Very good.
The Tetris was outstanding. Gauntlet was on there.
Tetris in particular, yeah.
Yeah. So there were some good games, but I mean, of course, like this led to a huge lawsuit.
Yes.
In the end, Tengen lost. They had to cease production of those unlicensed games. But at that point, the floodgates had been open, and some creative companies figured out ways to circumvent Nintendo's lockout.
Well, the funny thing is that Nintendo, on paper they didn't play favorites, but that's not particularly true.
You could argue maybe that they didn't.
But they kind of did, because you look at Konami, for example. Konami's output on the NES was incredible. I mean, legendary.
Or Capcom.
Capcom. Well, but what Konami did was interesting, because they created the Ultra Games label. So you would see Contra, for example. You would see Castlevania, and then you would see something like one of the Ultra games? Teenage Mutant
Turtles.
Yes, that was probably the biggest one that came out of Ultra. So they were able to circumvent just by kind of creating a separate company. But
Acclaim did this too with LJN.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and so that's how some of these companies got around some of those enforcements from Nintendo. So I mean, like it could be argued that some of their attempts at enforcing who could make games for this had a good side and it had a bad side for sure.
So now, how would we be able to tell if you were buying a Nintendo game that you were getting an official Nintendo game? What did you have?
Yeah, you had the Nintendo Seal of Quality.
Seal of Quality.
Right, so they put this on every cartridge.
Going back to LJN, I don't think it means what they think it means when they say quality.
No. No, it definitely doesn't.
I look at Back to the Future, I go, that doesn't belong, Seal of Quality. That just doesn't belong there. But that was their stamp of approval, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
This is official. This is by us, and we approve of this cartridge. Which a lot of the I guess I wouldn't say pirate games, but unlicensed. A lot of the unlicensed games, you would see that they would often have different colors and different packaging and that sort of thing, whereas the NES carts were by and large usually just the gray uniform.
They had
carts.
more consistent, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the way that the games were presented and sold to people. We were talking earlier about how you would go to a store to buy your Atari cartridge and you would see these fantastic, beautiful designs, beautiful artwork, and then you turned on the game, suddenly it's, you're a block and you're shooting other blocks, or you're doing things. Whereas Nintendo took a really novel approach to things and actually showed you what you were getting. I mean,
you see the real game sprites.
Right. Super Mario was the one that jumps out at me because it's so unusual. Because in the box art, Mario's pretty much gonna die.
Yeah, he's about to fall into a lava pit.
Yeah, things aren't working out well for Mario.
No, but you know what? But it was cool, and I think the upgrade in graphics for this particular generation was really good, and so I think that also may have been why they switched over to just showing the sprite games too. Not just to give people an honest depiction of like, yeah, this is what you're gonna get, but also because it stood out.
It was impressive.
Yeah,
it was.
It was like what you'd seen in the arcade, and so it really got people's attention.
Yes, it definitely did, and I think that was a big part of what made Nintendo such a huge success. Just a big combination of factors. But the fact that they were able to keep such a tight control over their output and what went on, and the fact that they were honest about what you were getting when you were buying these cartridges.
Yeah,
you know,
that's
so
right.
that was even Sega, the Master System. You saw the very plain packaging. You know, basically just like a grid
art. Yeah,
and then just a very strange looking little illustration.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like that's probably a good overview of what Generation 3 did for the video game industry, and you can really see a lot of these trends getting expanded on, continuing, and I feel like, you know, when you think about modern games, so much of what, you know, are the bedrock of modern games, you can trace all the way back to this moment in time.
Yeah, I think this is the birth of what we would consider, I think, modern gaming. The modern concepts of gaming, as far as
a lot of them come from this time period.
Yes, story, action, just, you know, melding the art form together, because I think this is when it truly became art as opposed to just simple entertainment.
Yeah.
You know, the ability to express yourself artistically in terms of visually, with the sound, you know, NES music, so many iconic, you know, soundtracks, and with the stories that you could tell stories and expand upon them, like sequels and things like that. Whereas in the past, that just wasn't
a thing.
Yeah. And we still see that today. You know, this is it's just the way it's going to go from
here
now on, from here on. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's it. I guess we're going to wrap up this segment, and yeah.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.